"Don't touch that." The rancher did it anyway, and froze in shock. The morning sun rose slowly over the wide, open plains of Montana, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the faint scent of hay and earth. On this sprawling ranch, the world seemed peaceful, almost untouched by time. Samuel Carter, the owner of the ranch, stepped out of his old wooden house, the boards creaking under his boots. He was a tall man, strong from years of working the land, with weathered skin and hands rough from decades of hard labor. To anyone who saw him, Samuel looked like someone who had seen it all, someone who could handle anything that came his way. As he walked toward the barn, he noticed the farmhands already moving about. Horses were being fed, the cows were being rounded up, and the scent of fresh hay mixed with the faint aroma of warm leather from the saddles. Life on the ranch was never easy, but it had a rhythm that everyone understood. Samuel liked that rhythm. He liked control. But today, something was different. Near the far corner of the barn, partially hidden under a dusty tarp, was an old wooden crate. It had clearly been there a long time. Its edges were worn and splintered, and the wood had darkened with age. But what caught Samuel's attention was the unusual sign nailed to the front. In bold letters, someone had written, "Do not touch." The words were simple, but they carried a strange weight, almost like a warning whispered through time. Samuel frowned. He was not a man to follow signs blindly. He had lived all his life on this land and had never believed in superstition or old stories. He crouched down to examine the crate. The wood was rough under his fingers, and the nails holding it together were rusted, but the warning was clear. He chuckled softly to himself. "A crate," he muttered. "Do not touch. Who writes such things?" The farmhand closest to him, a young man named Jesse, noticed Samuel's interest. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mr. Carter," Jesse said, trying to sound firm but nervous, "I don't think we should touch that crate. It's, I don't know, strange." Samuel looked at him, raising one eyebrow. "Strange?" he asked. "It's just an old box, probably something left here by the previous owner or some lost supplies. Nothing to worry about." Jesse hesitated. He had heard stories, of course. Everyone in the area had heard the old legends about the ranch, stories passed down from generation to generation. Tales of strange accidents in the barn, of frost that appeared suddenly in the summer, of animals found frozen in the fields with no explanation. But Samuel was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghost stories or old wives' tales. Still, Jesse tried one more time. "Sir, I know it looks like nothing, but the crate, it gives me the chills. Maybe we should leave it alone until we know what's inside." Samuel laughed, a deep, confident sound. "Chills? Jesse, you're imagining things. I've worked this land for more than 30 years. I've seen storms that could tear this barn apart and snakes that could swallow a rabbit hole. I think I can handle an old crate." He straightened up and walked closer. The air around the crate seemed colder than the rest of the barn, though the sun outside was already starting to warm the wooden structure. Samuel paused for a moment, noting the faint frost forming along the edges of the crate. "Huh," he said softly, running a hand over the wood. "That's odd, must be left over from last winter." Jesse looked uneasy, glancing at the crate and then at Samuel. He wanted to protest, but Samuel's confidence was overwhelming. There was no arguing with him when he had made up his mind, so Jesse stepped back, muttering under his breath, "I hope you know what you're doing, sir." Samuel ignored him and studied the crate more closely. The wood was cracked in places, and there were strange symbols carved faintly into the surface. They looked almost like letters, but none of them made sense. Some of the carvings were deeper than others, and they seemed to form patterns that caught the light in unusual ways. Samuel's curiosity was piqued. He had seen many old crates in his life, but never one like this. He leaned in closer, brushing away the dust and cobwebs. "Interesting," he murmured. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure this crate was noticed." A cold breeze blew through the barn, rustling the hay and making the horses shiver. Samuel paused, sensing something unusual, but he shook his head. "It's just the barn settling," he said aloud. "Nothing more." But even as he spoke, a sense of unease settled over him. The warning on the crate was too clear to ignore. It was as if someone or something was trying to keep him away. That thought made him smile. It was a challenge, and Samuel had never been one to back down from a challenge. He called to the other farmhands. "Bring me the crowbar. I want to see what's inside this crate." The young men exchanged nervous glances. They had heard of Samuel's stubbornness before, but this felt different. Something about the crate made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Still, they obeyed, fetching the tools Samuel requested. As Samuel worked to pry the crate open, he kept talking, almost as if trying to reassure himself. It's probably just old tools or maybe some antiques left behind. Nothing scary, nothing dangerous. But the deeper he dug, the colder the air became. His breath formed small clouds in front of his face, and frost began to creep along his sleeves. He paused, rubbing his hands together. "That's strange," he muttered. "It shouldn't be this cold in here." Jesse stepped closer, his voice trembling slightly. "Sir, maybe we should wait. The crate, it feels wrong." Samuel shook his head firmly. "I've waited long enough. I need to know what's inside. It's my land, my barn, my rules." With one final pull, the crate creaked and shifted. Dust rose in a cloud, making the air thick and dry. Samuel leaned in, peering into the darkness inside. He couldn't see much yet, only shadows and shapes, but something about it made him pause. There was a faint humming sound, almost like a whisper coming from inside the crate. Samuel frowned, listening carefully. The sound seemed alive, vibrating softly as if it were waiting for him. He shook his head again. "I'm being silly," he said, forcing a laugh. "It's just an old crate." But even as he spoke, he felt a strange sensation, a chill that ran up his arm, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. The barn, usually warm and familiar, suddenly felt strange, almost foreign. Samuel ignored it. He had faced storms, wild animals, and more than his share of accidents. Surely he could handle this. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface inside the crate. And in that moment, a shiver ran through him, stronger than anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just cold, it was a deep, biting cold that seemed to reach into his bones. Samuel froze for a moment, staring at his hand. Jesse gasped. "Sir, maybe," but Samuel cut him off. "No," he said firmly. "I need to see, I have to know." The rest of the farmhands watched in silence, their unease growing. The barn was quiet now, except for the faint humming from the crate and the sound of Samuel's controlled breathing. Outside, the sun climbed higher, but the barn seemed darker, almost isolated from the world. Samuel's curiosity burned stronger than his fear. He had never been one to back down, and he wasn't about to start now. Whatever was inside that crate, he was going to find out. The barn was quieter than usual after Samuel had touched the crate. The faint humming sound seemed to grow slightly louder, almost like it had been awakened by his touch. Samuel stepped back for a moment, brushing his hands on his pants to remove the dust, but he could feel a coldness lingering on his skin, a chill that shouldn't have been there on a sunny morning. He shook it off. He was Samuel Carter, seasoned, strong, and never one to be intimidated by a little cold or old wood. "All right," he said, trying to steady his voice. "Let's see what's really inside this crate." Jesse, still tense, stepped closer. "Sir, maybe we should just leave it, really. We don't know what's in there. What if it's dangerous?" Samuel waved him off with a laugh, but there was a slight edge to it. "Dangerous? Jesse, it's an old box. We've handled heavier things than this. I've seen wild animals run through this barn, storms break the roof, and I've survived worse. Trust me, I'll handle this." Still, the young farmhand hesitated. He had worked on this ranch for a year, and he had come to know Samuel well. Samuel was proud and stubborn, the kind of man who refused to let fear stop him. But something about this crate, something was different. Even the older farmhands, who had seen strange things over the years, kept their distance, murmuring quietly to one another. Samuel grabbed the crowbar and placed it under the lid of the crate. He could feel the frost under his fingers, cold and almost sticky, as if the wood itself had absorbed the chill. He pried slowly, the wood creaking loudly in protest. Dust rose into the air, swirling around the barn and making everyone cough. A sudden gust of wind seemed to blow through the barn, even though the doors were shut tight. The horses whinnied nervously, and the dogs barked, running back and forth as if sensing something unseen. Finally, with a loud snap, the lid of the crate lifted slightly. A strange light spilled out, pale and bluish, unlike anything Samuel had ever seen. He leaned closer, squinting into the shadows, trying to make sense of it. Shapes moved inside the crate, but they were unclear, distorted by the faint mist that rose from within. The hum grew louder, vibrating in the air, making the hair on the back of Samuel's neck stand up. "Do you see that?" Jesse whispered, his voice shaking. Samuel nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "Yes, but it's just some old tools or maybe equipment from before, nothing unusual." He reached out with one hand, brushing aside the mist, and that's when he felt it. It was colder than anything he had ever experienced, so cold it burned like fire. The frost seemed to creep up his arm as if it were alive, wrapping around him and spreading along his sleeve. Samuel jerked his arm back, startled, but curiosity pushed him forward again. He was determined to see what was inside, to solve the mystery of the crate that had sat in his barn, untouched for who knew how long. The farmhands watched in silence, worry etched on their faces. They had learned over the years to respect Samuel's stubbornness, but there was something different now. Even they could feel the cold in the air, a creeping frost that had no explanation. It made the barn seem smaller, more enclosed, as if the temperature itself was closing in on them. Samuel leaned closer, shining his lantern inside the crate. The light caught the edges of what looked like an old metal box, covered in frost and strange symbols. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, ancient, yet somehow preserved perfectly in the crate. The carvings seemed to glow faintly in the lantern light, pulsing as if in rhythm with the hum that filled the barn. "Sir," Jesse said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like this. Maybe we should wait for someone who knows about these things." Samuel frowned. "No, Jesse, we don't need anyone else. I've managed this ranch for years. I've dealt with worse than this." He touched the metal box gently, running his fingers along the cold surface. The frost seemed to spread faster now, forming delicate patterns on his hands, like tiny ice flowers blooming in an instant. A strange sensation ran through him, not quite painful but deeply unsettling, like a warning that something was very wrong. Still, Samuel's pride and curiosity kept him rooted in place. He opened the metal box slowly, the hinges squealing as if protesting against intrusion. Inside, he found what looked like a small, intricate object wrapped in cloth. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it seemed almost alive, pulsing slightly as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The hum grew louder, vibrating through Samuel's bones and making him feel dizzy. He pulled the cloth aside, revealing a crystal-like object, clear and icy, yet shimmering with colors that seemed impossible in the natural world. It was small enough to hold in one hand, but Samuel could feel its weight, not in pounds, but in something heavier, something almost physical pressing against him. The frost in the barn grew thicker, swirling in the air and settling on the walls and floor. Even the horses backed away, sensing danger. Jesse grabbed Samuel's arm, panic in his eyes. "Sir, stop, you don't know what that is." But Samuel couldn't pull away. The object seemed to call to him, and even as the cold bit into his fingers and climbed up his arm, he felt compelled to hold it. For a moment, he froze, staring at the crystal, trying to make sense of the impossible colors shimmering within. And then it happened. The barn seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, colder, and the light from the lantern flickered strangely. Samuel felt a pressure on his chest, as if the crystal was pushing back against him, testing him. The frost spread faster now, creeping up his arms and legs, making him shiver uncontrollably. The hum reached a high-pitched tone, vibrating in the barn's wooden beams, and the horses whinnied loudly, pawing the ground in panic. Samuel's breath formed thick clouds, hanging in the air like smoke. His hands were turning numb, but he refused to let go. Curiosity and stubbornness overpowered fear. He leaned closer, peering into the crystal, trying to see what made it so strange. Then a vision flashed before his eyes, brief, fragmented, like a memory from another time. He saw the ranch long ago, as it had been when his grandfather first settled the land. He saw strange storms, frost appearing out of nowhere, and animals freezing in the fields. He saw old warnings carved into trees and barns, warnings that had been ignored by those before him. Samuel pulled back, gasping for air, his heart racing. The frost on his hands was spreading faster now, covering parts of his skin with a thin layer of ice. He looked at the farmhands who were frozen in fear and realized that this was no ordinary crate, no ordinary object. There was power here, something unnatural and ancient. "Step back," Jesse shouted, shaking Samuel's arm. "It's dangerous, I can feel it." Samuel nodded, finally letting go of the crystal, but the moment his fingers left it, the hum began to fade slowly, and the frost in the barn receded slightly. The pressure on his chest eased, and the air began to warm again. The horses calmed, and the dogs stopped barking, though a tense silence remained. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to understand what had just happened. The crate, the frost, the crystal, everything felt alive, almost aware. And yet somehow it was still here waiting, as if it had chosen him for a reason. He looked at the young farmhands, their faces pale and wide-eyed. "All right," he said slowly, his voice low. I admit that was unusual, but we need to know more. We need to figure out what this is and why it's here. Jesse shook his head. Sir, I don't think we should touch it again. Maybe we should call someone a historian, a scientist, anyone who might understand this. This is bigger than us. Samuel nodded slowly, considering. Pride and curiosity battled with fear and respect. He had faced danger many times, but never like this. He realized that the crate and whatever was inside was beyond ordinary experience, and yet the mystery called to him, daring him to discover its secrets. For the rest of the day, Samuel and the farmhands kept watch over the crate. The frost remained faint, and the humming was gone, but the memory of the cold and the strange vision lingered in Samuel's mind. He felt both excitement and unease. This crate had a story, a power, and perhaps even a warning. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Samuel knew one thing: he could not ignore this. He could not pretend it was just an old crate. Something was here, something powerful, and it had chosen him, or perhaps he had chosen it. The night had settled over the ranch, casting long shadows across the wide fields and the old wooden barn. The moon hung low in the sky, pale and silver, bathing the landscape in an eerie glow. Inside the barn, Samuel Carter could feel the chill lingering from the crate. It was not just ordinary cold. It was sharp, biting, almost alive. The air was heavier now, carrying a tension that seemed to press down on everything inside the barn. Samuel stood near the crate, hands trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it. He had spent hours examining it during the day, and yet the more he studied it, the more questions arose. What was this strange object inside? Why had it been left here, hidden for so long? And why did it react to him the way it did? The farmhands were nearby, standing at a safe distance. They had tried to leave earlier, insisting that they call someone, an expert, a scientist, a historian, but Samuel refused. He had promised them he would be careful, that he would handle it himself. Pride, curiosity, and the need to know the truth kept him rooted in place. He reached toward the crate once more, and the moment his fingers brushed the icy metal box inside, a wave of cold shot up his arm. It was sharper than before, biting through his skin and making his muscles tense. Samuel gasped, pulling back instinctively, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than the fear. He had to see what was inside. As he lifted the lid further, a strange mist rolled out, curling around his arms like thin, icy fingers. It was colder than anything he had experienced, and he could see frost forming instantly on the wooden floor and the barn walls. The light from the lantern caught the mist, giving it a bluish glow that seemed unnatural, almost magical. Samuel shivered, though he tried to convince himself it was only the cold. The crystal inside the box shimmered with a soft, otherworldly light. It pulsed faintly, almost like a heartbeat, and the hum that had disappeared earlier returned, low and vibrating through the air. Samuel felt the vibration in his chest, in his bones, as if the object itself was alive and aware of him. Sir, Jesse's voice trembled, breaking the silence. I think you should stop. This isn't normal. Look at the frost. It's spreading faster. Samuel glanced around and saw the thin layer of frost crawling along the floorboards and reaching toward the farmhands. He could see their breath in the air, small clouds hanging in the lantern light. Even the horses and dogs were uneasy, watching from their stalls, ears flat, tails low. I know it's strange, Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. But I need to know. I have to understand it. He reached out and lifted the crystal from the box. The moment his fingers touched it, a shock ran through him. The cold was so intense it felt like ice flowing through his veins. His muscles stiffened, and he staggered backward, clutching the object. The frost spread up his arms, creeping along his torso, and Samuel could see his breath fogging heavily in front of him. The humming grew louder, filling the barn with a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate through every beam, every nail, every plank of wood. Samuel could feel it deep in his chest, a pressure that made it hard to think. Panic flashed in his mind, but he fought it down, determined to hold on. He had faced danger before, storms, wild animals, accidents. But this was something different. Something he could not explain. The frost was spreading quickly now, moving across the floor, walls, and even the ceiling. It danced in the air, forming delicate ice patterns that glimmered in the lantern light. Samuel's fingers were numb, his face pale from the cold, yet he refused to let go. He wanted answers, and he was willing to endure the pain to get them. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound echoed in the barn like ice cracking. Samuel froze, the crystal still in his hand. The sound reverberated through the air, making the barn shake slightly. His heart pounded, and for the first time, fear began to creep in. The frost was spreading faster than he could anticipate, covering his sleeves and starting to form on his legs. Jesse and the other farmhands took a cautious step back, shouting warnings. "Sir, please put it down, you're going to freeze." Samuel tried to speak, but his teeth chattered. I can't, I need to." His voice was shaky, barely audible over the humming. The frost had reached his shoulders now, forming thin sheets along his skin. His hands were stiff and pale, and he could barely feel the crystal in his grip. For a moment, Samuel thought of letting go, but a strange compulsion held him tight. The crystal seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, as if it were connected to him in some way. The barn felt alive, responding to the energy between him and the object. The air grew heavier, colder, almost tangible, and the farmhands could see the mist swirling faster, forming shapes that were difficult to comprehend. Samuel's vision blurred slightly, and he felt a strange pressure in his chest, like a weight pressing down on him. His muscles ached from the cold, but still he did not release the crystal. Instead, he leaned closer, trying to see its depth, trying to understand the source of the strange energy. And then a vision struck him. It was sudden, fleeting, and disorienting. He saw the ranch as it had been long ago, fields blanketed in snow during months when summer should have reigned. He saw livestock frozen where they stood, trees coated in frost, and buildings that seemed alive with strange, shimmering energy. He saw warnings carved into wood and stone, messages left by those who had come before him, telling anyone who dared approach to beware. The vision ended as quickly as it came, leaving Samuel gasping and disoriented. He stumbled back, the crystal still in his hands, now heavier than ever. The frost continued to spread, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening in the enclosed space of the barn. "Sir, please," Jesse shouted, panic rising in his voice. "You have to put it down." Samuel's mind raced. He realized that this object, whatever it was, had a power beyond his understanding. The frost, the hum, the visions, they were all connected. And now he felt it fully. The cold was no longer just around him. It was inside him, creeping along his veins and muscles, making him stiff, making him shiver uncontrollably. With great effort, Samuel set the crystal down on the floor of the crate. The moment it left his hands, the hum faded slightly and the frost stopped spreading for a moment. But the cold inside him remained, biting and relentless. His chest heaved, his teeth chattered, and he could barely move. The farmhands rushed to his side, wrapping him in thick blankets and guiding him to a chair. Samuel sat, shivering violently, watching the crate. The crystal inside continued to pulse faintly, the glow dim but steady. He realized that this object was not something to handle lightly. It was alive in a way, and it demanded respect. The frost slowly receded from the barn, leaving a thin layer of ice on the floor and walls. The horses and dogs relaxed, though they still eyed the crate warily. Samuel wrapped himself tighter in the blankets, his mind racing with questions. What was this crystal? Why had it been left here? And what had it shown him in that vision? Even as he recovered slightly from the cold, a part of him remained fascinated. The curiosity that had driven him to touch the crate in the first place was still alive, stronger than ever. But now it was mixed with fear and respect, a recognition that this was something beyond human understanding. He looked at Jesse and the other farmhands who were pale and shaken. "We need to figure this out," he said slowly. "We can't just leave it here, but we have to be careful. I don't know what this is, but it's powerful, and it's dangerous." The farmhands nodded, still wary but willing to follow Samuel. They had seen enough to understand that this was no ordinary object. The barn felt different now, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Samuel sat for a long while, wrapped in blankets, trying to calm himself. His mind replayed the vision, the frost, and the pulsing crystal. He knew that he had crossed a line by touching it, that he had awakened something ancient and powerful. And he also knew that he could not ignore it. The night passed slowly, the barn silent except for the faint sound of the wind outside. Samuel kept watch over the crate, determined to understand it, to learn its secrets. But he also knew that the next time he approached it, he would need to be ready. The frost, the visions, the cold, they had shown him a small part of its power, and he had only begun to understand the danger. By the time the first light of dawn touched the fields outside, Samuel felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. He had survived the night, but he had been forever changed. The crate was no longer just an old object in his barn. It was a force, something that demanded attention and respect. He looked at the crystal again, its glow faint but steady, and whispered to himself, "I will understand you. Somehow I will." The frost had receded, the hum had faded, but the memory of the cold, the visions, and the overwhelming power lingered in Samuel's mind. He knew that whatever lay ahead would be more dangerous, more challenging, and more mysterious than anything he had faced before. And deep down, he could feel that the crate had chosen him, not by accident, but for a reason that he had yet to discover. The morning sunlight barely pierced the heavy mist that still clung to the barn, a faint residue from the strange frost that had settled overnight. Samuel Carter sat on a worn wooden chair, wrapped in blankets, trying to calm the lingering chill in his bones. His hands were still pale and stiff from the frost, and his mind refused to stop replaying the events of the previous night. Every detail, the cold, the pulsing crystal, the visions, was etched into his memory like a brand. Jesse and the other farmhands hovered nearby, still shaken. They had never seen Samuel so affected, so cautious. Normally he faced storms, wild animals, and all kinds of ranch accidents with steady hands and a confident smile. But now he was different. He was quiet, almost reflective, and his eyes carried a seriousness that made the barn feel heavier. "What do we do now, sir?" Jesse asked cautiously, glancing at the crystal still nestled in the crate. His voice was hesitant, carrying the weight of fear and respect. Samuel looked down at the object. The crystal seemed calm, its soft glow pulsing slowly, almost like a heartbeat. But Samuel could feel the energy still radiating from it, a power that was almost suffocating in its intensity. He sighed, running his hands over his face. "We need to understand it," he said slowly. "We can't just ignore this, but we must be careful. This is not a normal object. It's alive in a way I can't explain." The frost on the barn floor had mostly melted, leaving faint traces of ice that glimmered in the morning sun. But Samuel could still feel the cold in his chest, creeping along his spine like a whisper of what had come before. He realized that touching the crystal had changed him somehow, not physically, but mentally. His senses were sharper, his thoughts heavier, and a deep awareness settled in him. A recognition that this crate and what it contained was older and more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. He took a deep breath and moved closer to the crate again, careful this time. The crystal pulsed faintly, almost as if it were aware of his presence. Samuel's hand hovered above it, not touching, just feeling the energy radiating from the object. It was a strange, almost magnetic force, drawing him in while warning him at the same time. He shivered, but it wasn't just from the cold. Something about the crystal pressed against his mind, testing him. Jesse noticed Samuel's hesitation. "Sir, maybe we should wait for someone who knows about these things. This is bigger than any of us." Samuel shook his head slowly, but a hint of agreement lingered in his eyes. He knew Jesse was right. He had faced many challenges on the ranch, storms, injuries, animals, but this was different. This was not natural. It was something ancient, something beyond understanding, and yet he could not leave it alone. Curiosity had driven him this far, and he would see it through. He leaned closer to the crate and peered into the soft glow of the crystal. The patterns inside seemed to shift and change, moving as if alive. Samuel's mind was flooded with images, visions of the ranch in the past, strange figures moving in the frost, animals frozen where they stood, warnings etched in wood and stone. The visions were fragmented, almost dreamlike, but they carried a clear message: respect the power or suffer the consequences. A sudden gust of wind blew through the barn, though all doors and windows were closed. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that danced along the walls. The crystal pulsed brighter, and the frost that had been melted overnight began to return in thin, delicate layers along the barn floor and walls. Samuel felt a chill run through him, sharper than before, like the cold was seeking him out specifically. He touched the crate again, this time only brushing the edge of the crystal with his fingertips. Immediately, a shock ran through his body, freezing his muscles for a moment. His breath came out in thick clouds, and his heart raced. The frost seemed to respond to him, spreading in swirling patterns that formed almost like writing on the barn floor. Samuel realized he could not control it. It responded to his presence and perhaps even his thoughts. The farm hands watched in fear, but they did not intervene. They had learned long ago that Samuel's stubbornness could not be stopped, and they feared that any interference might worsen the situation. Instead, they stood back, silent and tense, their eyes fixed on the strange spectacle unfolding before them. Samuel tried to focus, to understand what the crystal wanted. He reached out mentally, willing himself to connect, to learn. And then the visions came again, stronger and more vivid. He saw the ranch long ago, but this time the images were clear. He saw a man, his ancestor, who had encountered the crystal decades earlier. The man had left warnings, messages carved into the barn, into trees, into stones, that were meant to protect future generations. Samuel saw the consequences of ignoring the warnings: frost that could freeze life instantly, strange accidents, and a sense of unease that lingered across the land. The realization hit him hard. This crate, this crystal, was not just an object, it was a force. It had rules, demands, and consequences. Ignoring it, touching it recklessly, could have severe effects. The frost, the cold, the visions, they were all part of a warning, and Samuel had already crossed the line. He pulled back, gasping for air. His hands were numb and his chest felt tight from the lingering cold. The hum of the crystal had softened, but it was still present, a low vibration that resonated in the barn. Samuel wrapped his arms around himself, shivering violently. He looked at Jesse and the other farmhands. I understand now," he said slowly, his voice trembling slightly. "This is not something we can take lightly. It has power I cannot explain, and it reacts to us, to our presence, our thoughts, our actions. We must respect it, or—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but the farmhands understood. They had seen the frost, the visions, the crystal pulsing. They knew the danger. Jesse stepped closer, his face pale but determined. "Sir, we have to be careful. We need to protect ourselves and the ranch. We can't let this crystal control us or harm anyone." Samuel nodded, still shivering but determined. He realized that knowledge alone was not enough. Action was required. The crystal could not be ignored, but it could not be handled carelessly. They needed a plan, a way to study it safely, to learn its secrets without being harmed. He took a deep breath and approached the crate again, this time with caution. He did not touch the crystal directly. Instead, he placed a thick cloth over it, trying to shield himself from the direct energy. The pulsing continued faintly beneath the fabric, but it was less intense. Samuel felt slightly more in control, though the cold still lingered, gnawing at his bones. The farmhands watched silently as Samuel worked. He used tools and blankets to create a buffer between himself and the crystal, determined to understand it without putting himself at risk. The frost had slowed, but it had not disappeared entirely. Small patterns of ice glimmered in the lantern light, moving almost as if alive. Hours passed, and Samuel gradually began to regain his strength. The initial shock had passed, but the lesson was clear. Curiosity could be dangerous if paired with recklessness. He realized that this crystal and the crate it came from had a consciousness of its own, a way of responding to human interaction. It was a test, a warning, and a challenge all at once. By the late afternoon, Samuel had calmed enough to speak more clearly. "We must learn from this," he said to the farmhands. "We cannot ignore it, but we also cannot handle it carelessly. It is alive in a way, and it has rules. If we respect it, we may understand it. If we do not, it will teach us harshly." The farmhands nodded, still wary but willing to follow Samuel's lead. They had seen too much to doubt him now. The barn was quiet again, save for the soft hum of the crystal beneath the cloth and the faint sound of the wind outside. The frost glimmered faintly, a reminder of the power they were dealing with. Samuel sat back in his chair, exhausted but more aware than ever. He understood that the crystal had shown him the consequences of ignoring warnings, the reality of forces beyond human comprehension. The visions, the frost, the cold, they were all a language, a way to communicate with those who dared to interact with it. And Samuel Carter had dared. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the barn. Samuel looked at the crystal one last time for the day. Its glow was faint, steady, almost peaceful under the cloth. He knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more questions, and possibly more danger. But he was ready. Curiosity still burned within him, but now it was tempered by respect and understanding. He whispered to himself, almost as if making a promise, "I will learn your secrets, but I will not be careless. I will respect you, and I will survive this." For the first time since touching the crystal, Samuel felt a measure of control, though he knew the crystal's power was far from fully revealed. The frost had receded somewhat, the visions had faded, but the hum remained, a constant reminder that the object was alive, aware, and waiting. The morning sun rose slowly over the ranch, spilling soft golden light across the fields and the barn. The air was crisp, but warmer than it had been the night before. Samuel Carter moved carefully, still feeling the lingering cold in his bones, a reminder of what he had endured with the crate and its mysterious crystal. He was quiet now, thoughtful, and for the first time, fully aware of the power that had been hidden in his barn for decades. Jesse and the other farmhands were already at work, tending the animals and cleaning the barn. They moved cautiously, casting occasional glances at the crate, which sat in the far corner, covered carefully with blankets and thick cloths. No one dared touch it. The crystal inside pulsed faintly, almost as if it were breathing, a constant reminder that the object was alive in some way, aware and patient. Samuel approached the crate slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He knew that what he had experienced was a warning, a lesson in respect, caution, and humility. The frost, the visions, the cold, they were all part of the crystal's way of communicating. He reached out, not to touch it directly, but to ensure that the cloth covering it was secure. He wanted to prevent any accidents while they figured out the next steps. The farmhands watched him, tense but trusting. Samuel had changed. The confident, stubborn man they knew was still there, but now he carried a deeper understanding. He had learned that curiosity, while valuable, could also be dangerous if not balanced with respect and caution. The crate and its crystal were proof of that. He turned to Jesse, who had been standing nearby, still pale from the events of the previous night. "We can't just ignore it," Samuel said quietly. "It's not just a strange object, it's powerful, and it needs to be treated carefully. We need to understand it before anyone else touches it. If we handle it properly, we may learn its secrets." If not, he didn't finish the sentence. The memory of the frost and the cold still lingered too strongly. Jesse nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand, sir. We'll be careful. We'll follow your lead." Samuel spent the rest of the day examining the barn and the crate, taking careful notes on everything he observed. He used tools, blankets, and makeshift barriers to ensure that the crystal could not react unpredictably. The frost no longer spread, but small patterns remained along the barn walls and floor, delicate lines of ice that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Samuel studied them closely, wondering if they were part of the crystal's message, a language he had yet to fully understand. As the hours passed, Samuel reflected on the visions he had seen. The images of the ranch in the past, the warnings etched into wood and stone, and the frozen animals, it all made sense now. The crystal was more than just an object. It was a guardian of sorts, a force connected to the land and its history. It had rules, demands, and consequences. Samuel had learned them the hard way, but now he understood. By late afternoon, Samuel decided to speak to the farmhands about what had happened. They gathered around him in the barn, still cautious, still wary, but eager to hear what he had learned. Samuel looked at each of them in turn, his eyes serious but calm. "Listen carefully," he began. "What we experienced was not a coincidence. The crate, the crystal, the frost, it was all a warning. Curiosity alone is not enough. We must respect what we do not fully understand. If we ignore it, we risk more than just discomfort or fear. We risk danger, accidents, and perhaps worse." The farmhands nodded solemnly. They had seen enough to understand that Samuel was not exaggerating. The frost, the cold, the visions, it was all real, and it had left a lasting impression on their minds. Samuel continued. "From now on, we handle this carefully. We will not touch the crystal directly. We will observe, study, and document, but only with caution. And we will share what we learn so that no one else makes the same mistake we almost made." Jesse spoke up, his voice steady despite lingering fear. "Sir, what will happen to the crystal? Should we leave it here or move it somewhere safer?" Samuel considered this for a moment. The crate and crystal had been here for decades, untouched, until he came along. Moving it recklessly could provoke the same kind of reaction they had experienced. "We leave it here," he said finally. "But we secure it carefully and we protect it. The barn will be safe, but the crystal will not be ignored. It has lessons to teach, and we will learn from it without taking unnecessary risks." The farmhands worked together, using extra blankets, wooden boards, and ropes to secure the crate. Samuel watched closely, ensuring that every precaution was taken. By the time they finished, the barn felt safe, though the lingering sense of energy from the crystal remained. Samuel could feel it faintly, pulsing under the cloth, a reminder that this was not an ordinary object. As evening fell, Samuel stood alone in the barn for a moment, looking at the crate. He reflected on what had happened, on the fear, the frost, and the visions. He thought about the power of the object and the responsibility it had placed on him. He realized that this was more than just a strange discovery. It was a turning point, a lesson in humility, caution, and respect for forces beyond human understanding. He also realized that he had changed. The confidence and stubbornness that had once defined him were now tempered with patience, observation, and respect. He would not be reckless again. He would not let curiosity blind him. He had seen the consequences of carelessness, and he would remember them for the rest of his life. The farmhands joined him as he prepared to leave the barn for the night. They moved quietly, the events of the past 2 days still fresh in their minds. The ranch felt different now, as if it had shifted in subtle ways. The air seemed lighter, but the memory of the frost and the strange energy remained, a constant reminder of what had occurred. Samuel took one last look at the crate before closing the barn doors. The crystal pulsed faintly beneath the cloth, almost as if it were acknowledging him. He smiled faintly, a mixture of pride, relief, and cautious respect. "We will learn from you," he whispered, "and we will respect your power." Over the following weeks, Samuel and the farmhands established a careful routine. They observed the crate without touching it directly, documenting any changes in the frost, the hum, or the crystal's glow. Samuel studied the visions that occasionally returned in his dreams, trying to piece together the history and meaning behind the crystal. The barn remained safe, the frost no longer spreading beyond the crate, but the lessons of the experience lingered with everyone who had witnessed it. Word of the strange events spread quietly among trusted neighbors, though Samuel was careful not to sensationalize it. The story became a cautionary tale, a lesson in respect for the unknown. He spoke of curiosity tempered with caution, of lessons learned without recklessness, and of the importance of listening to warnings, even when they seemed strange or unbelievable. Life on the ranch returned to its usual rhythm, but Samuel never forgot the crate or the crystal. The frost, the visions, the cold, they were etched into his memory, a reminder that some things are beyond human understanding, and that respect and caution are the best tools when dealing with the unknown. Years later, the crate remained in the barn, carefully secured and observed. Samuel had learned to live with its presence, neither fearing it nor ignoring it. The crystal continued to pulse faintly, a silent guardian of the ranch, and Samuel had become its careful steward. He shared the lessons he had learned with anyone willing to listen. That curiosity must be balanced with respect, that warnings are not to be ignored, and that even the most experienced and confident person can be humbled by forces beyond their understanding. The ranch thrived, the animals were healthy, and the land remained productive. But for Samuel Carter, the experience with the crate and its crystal had changed him forever. He had faced something ancient and powerful, and he had survived, not because of strength or pride, but because he had learned to listen, to observe, and to respect what he did not fully understand. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind blew gently across the fields and the barn doors creaked softly, Samuel could feel the faint pulse of the crystal beneath the cloth. He would smile, knowing that the mysterious object had chosen him for a reason, had taught him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life, and would continue to remind him that some things are better approached with care, curiosity, and respect. The ranch was calm, the frost no longer a threat, and the crystal remained a silent, mysterious presence. Samuel had faced the unknown and come through wiser, stronger, and forever changed. The experience had been frightening, humbling, and enlightening. And as the sun set behind the mountains, casting warm light over the barn and the fields, Samuel Carter knew that the lessons of the crate and its crystal would remain with him always. A story of caution, curiosity, and respect for the mysteries that exist just beyond human understanding.